Now, let me keep it in the ACC since we're talking about Miami, because a lot of people are saying the ACC is in big trouble. It was a terrible week for the ACC. And that is true on some level, but not necessarily in the way that people are saying. So let's break down what happened. Now, it's important to point out that when everyone talks about conference supremacy and like, is this conference in trouble? Is this one? They're always looking at it through a college football playoff lens, right? The only thing these guys on ESPN care about when they're talking about this conference better than that conference is, do they have a team alive for the playoff? And obviously that's kind of important, mostly from a revenue standpoint. You want representation in the playoff. It's going to bring home more money. It's going to make your brand look good on the biggest stage, having representation in that playoff. But in reality, the way sports work, when you're measuring how good are these group of teams compared to these group of teams, is just how good the teams are top to bottom, right? If you had a conference that had a bunch of 9-3 and 8-4 football teams, and you compared that to a conference that maybe had one amazing team that went to the playoff, or even maybe two, but then the rest of the teams in that particular conference were super mediocre or borderline terrible, I would take the conference with all the 8-4 teams. That would be a better conference. How deep is your conference? That's the real question, right? The SEC is the best conference. It's not because they have an Alabama or maybe another team like a Georgia that looks like they could make the playoff. It's because once you get under those teams, you've got like usually like a couple 9-3 teams, a couple 8-4 teams, and even their 6-6 teams. A lot of times you feel like can go and dominate Pac-12 6-6 teams, ACC 6-6 teams. That's why the SEC is considered the best most of the time. It's not because of what's happening on the top. It's more about what isn't happening in the middle and the bottom, right? So when we bring this back to the ACC, for me, it's not a problem that Miami lost to Alabama, okay? Again, yes, you'd like them to be more competitive, but the second or third best team in the ACC, at least on paper right now, this could change. Maybe Miami's terrible. But going into the season, the ACC had 3 teams that had playoff hopes, right? Oh, Clemson, number 3. North Carolina, number 10. Miami, number 14. And all 3 of those teams lost. That's the main reason why ESPN, these analysts are saying the ACC is in big trouble, right? Where I think it's for other reasons and other matchups, right? I don't care that Miami lost to Alabama because I think anybody would have lost to Alabama, right? Clemson losing to Georgia isn't that big of a deal. Forget the fact that you're concerned about Clemson's offense, right? Just from the standpoint of losing a close game to another top 5 team, that's not so bad for the ACC, right? Like when you're talking about games that could have gone either way, Clemson went and played a top 5 team. It happened to be an SEC team, could have been Ohio State, could have been anyone who was ranked high, right? Could have been Oklahoma, whoever. And they dropped that game, okay? Forget how the game looked for a second. That's not a big deal, okay? That's a quality loss. The whole point of scheduling those big games is that if you lose, it's a quality loss, right? And if Clemson turns it around, gets their offense back on track, runs through the ACC at 11-1, plays in the ACC championship game, and wins it at 12-1, there's like a 90% chance they go to the college football playoff once again. So Clemson as a team is on trouble. Them losing to Georgia isn't a disaster for the ACC, right? Miami losing to Alabama is also not a disaster for the ACC. North Carolina, Virginia Tech is also the exact opposite of a disaster for the ACC. In the sense of their playoff hopes, it hurts because you thought North Carolina was one of those teams that maybe could be that ranked opponent that meets Clemson in the ACC championship game, and you're hoping for a 10-2 type of season out of them, which is still completely possible, guys. They could turn it around, but they lost a conference game. Virginia Tech looked good in this game. So is it a bad loss for the ACC, or is it a good win for the ACC because an ACC team won that game? Yes, from the playoff picture, you're like, oh no, one of our ranked teams went down, but maybe Virginia Tech's the best team in this division. We don't know. We don't know. Here's where the ACC was trouble. Also, the Florida State Notre Dame game. If anything, that looked better for the ACC because we expected Florida State to lose that game. But Florida State played way better than we thought they did. And Notre Dame, it wasn't because they looked like they were worse than we thought, because I talked about this on the Instagram page. One of the games I uploaded yesterday was that 2016 Texas Notre Dame game, which was also on a Sunday night. And when that game was played, you had a top 10 Notre Dame team playing a Texas team that was trying to, get back in the big picture. Texas wins the game in overtime. It's super epic. And of course, you heard the famous Texas is back. And it turned out that was a fluke, right? Both of those teams ended up being terrible. Maybe that's the same case here for Notre Dame and Florida State, right? But I think Notre Dame is still pretty good, and it was more of Florida State playing up to Notre Dame's level than it was maybe Notre Dame took a huge step backwards and played down to a bad Florida State team's level. But only time will tell. Only time will tell. Considering that Notre Dame might still be really good, if Notre Dame is a top 10 team, this was actually a good game for the ACC because instead of getting blown out and showing that one of the Atlantic Blue Bloods in Florida State is still down, it showed that maybe Florida State's going to actually compete for the division this year, which would be incredible, not just for me as a Florida State fan, but I think for the ACC, for everyone in the sport that wants to see conferences elevate, right, and try to maybe catch the SEC here, that is important, right? But anyway, let's talk about more what was actually damaging for the ACC. What really hurt the ACC was Georgia Tech losing to Northern Illinois. Duke losing to Charlotte, guys. And I actually think the worst thing that happened to the ACC all weekend was what happened last night in Louisville losing to Ole Miss. That is a perfect game to determine where conferences are because you had a middle tier ACC team going up against a middle tier SEC team. And they pretty much got ran off the field. That is way more concerning to me than Miami getting blown out by Bama or Clemson losing to Georgia. Because, like I said, the Clemson-Georgia, it was a close game. So, yeah, wins matter, losses matter. But at the end of the day, that just showed that two of the best teams in these conferences are both good. Miami lost to Alabama. That showed that there is a big gap between the top of the SEC and the rest of the top of the ACC. But I think anyone would have lost pretty bad to Bama. So you can live with it. But having one of your middle-tier teams get pretty much ran off the field by a middle-tier SEC team, an SEC team that didn't even have their head coach on the sideline, that is problematic, right? So to me, that is more of an example showing that the ACC might not be as strong and be in trouble because you got to go win those games, right? Louisville beating Ole Miss shows that, hey, we have that big non-conference win. We're coming into conference play with a decent-looking win on our resume. And then if we lose conference games, it doesn't matter as much because now we're beating up on each other. But when we played outside of the conference, we showed that we're legit. Louisville's not going to be able to say that this year, right? And Georgia Tech, that was also a terrible one. Georgia Tech, they're supposed to be getting better. They're supposed to be recruiting better. And then they go drop this game to Northern Illinois. Yeah, you expect Georgia Tech to maybe lose to North Carolina, Miami, Virginia Tech this year. But can you at least come into conference play undefeated, considering you don't have any big non-conference games you're playing? I mean, if Georgia Tech would have went and lost to a quality opponent, right? If they would have lost to the Ole Miss, if they would have lost to, some Big Ten school or something, okay, not great, but you live with it. But dropping games to Northern Illinois, Duke losing to Charlotte, like that is the problem. Now, the ACC is going to have some chance for redemption. NC State, right, they dominated their non-conference opponent, which was South Florida, right? Not some FCS school, an okay group of 5 school from the American. They dominated them, and they're going to go play Mississippi State. This game, I think, is huge for the ACC this next week because you have a middle of the pack, again, ACC team playing a middle of the pack, sort of, maybe more of a bottom, SEC team. If Mississippi State beats NC State, even if it's close, that would be probably the worst loss for the ACC so far. You also have a Pitt team that looks decent, who they won their opening game. Yeah, it was against UMass, who's absolutely terrible, but they beat them 51-7. And now they're going to be playing Tennessee. This is another example of a middle tier team playing a middle tier team. And I think if the ACC can win both of these games, if NC State beats Mississippi State, and if Pitt can go win at Tennessee, that is going to be major redemption for the ACC going forward, right? Now, if that does happen, they won't get credit for it in the national picture because nobody thinks those two teams are playoff caliber. So, and this is the problem with the whole SEC dominance narrative. Although it's true, SEC is the best. Let's not take that away from them at all. If the SEC drops, let's say, these next two games, right? Or if Louisville would have won last night, you wouldn't have heard much about it. It wouldn't have been like, oh, ACC team beats SEC team. They just would have been like, oh, this sucks for Ole Miss, right? If Pitt beats Tennessee next week, and if NC State beats Mississippi State next week, no credit will be given the ACC, and more importantly, no one's going to talk about that being bad for the SEC because they'll just be like, well, Georgia and Alabama look really good and can maybe make the playoff, and so is Texas A&M.